What's going on, humans, and welcome to a new Psicoactivo. We have a very special treat for you today for a second time on the show, and one of the very first guests we ever had, Dr. Àlex Gómez-Marín, a theoretical physicist, a PhD in theoretical physicist. How's it going, Àlex? Welcome back to the show.
I think you're taking off with your show. I've seen you doing lots of these very frequently, and estoy feliz de estar contigo, querido. So I'm really happy to be with you today again.
It's definitely been quite the wild ride for both you and me, because you've also been very busy, man. And I want to go into that quite a bit. But before we do that, I want to go into something you did. You recently wrote an article for what's the website called? IAI News?
The Institute of Arts and Ideas, right?
Yes. Yeah. That made some really serious waves. The title is, the initial title you gave it was...
the editors chose that one, but then I asked if it could be changed to another one. So we have two titles to pick. Yeah, go ahead.
Tell me the one that the editor chose first, because that was...
I think they chose a quote from my very article, something like, "Science publishing is a multi-dollar Ponzi scheme." I think they chose that, which is fine. I said it, but the main point of the article, there are many, but the main point was what now I think it's the current title, which is "Preaching Dogma in the Name of Science." That's mainly what I'm talking about.
And what does that mean? Why is this happening in your opinion? Because I am very interested to hear this opinion from you and for the viewers, because I agree with pretty much everything you said on that article, but I want to hear your perspective now that you've written it.
Yeah, there's a lot to say. Science today can behave as a new religion, because today we go and ask the expert, who's usually a scientist, for kind of the truth, or whatever's closest to the truth. And that has its merits and it makes sense. But at the same time, when one abuses that authority, and then one starts pontificating ideologies, covert metaphysics, political agendas, and so on, when one pushes those in the name of science, then everything becomes very dangerous. And so another thing I say in the article, which of course I mean to sound harsh so that we can wake up, but I say also that scientism can be more dangerous than pseudoscience. Because of that reason, everybody is kind of aware of, well, if you're pretending this is science and it's not, then it's pseudoscience. But what about the other side? What about the backstage? What about all these situations where the expert says, or science says, and actually science doesn't say that, because science is complex, has many voices, and it's never a final truth. And in particular, in that article, I'm making a distinction between the media celebrities, which have their merits, like the deGrasse Tyson and Dawkins and all these guys, who are obviously very clever and have a lot to say. But I sense, and I think many people will share that they've been degenerating into a way of speaking that probably to the so-called lay person sounds terribly arrogant. On the other hand, we have other people that I like, and some people don't. That's fine, like Gary Nolan or Eric Weinstein, and they speak in the name of science with a very different tone and a very different rhetorics, right? So I think we should have, as I say at the end, less deGrasse Tysons and more Gary Nolans, and actually a long list of people who are in the media space. So another way of saying this, I often speak about science as this stool that has three legs. Of course, data, please, theory, but then the third stool, the third leg, which is really important for the thing to stand up, is actually what you and other people are doing, is media, is communicating. It's the thing that has to do with the socio-political aspects. And that's usually never spoken about in the laboratories. And we need to talk about it.
And that goes hand in hand with an old concept that has been very prevalent within the phenomenology arena, which is this concept of the invisible college. They Their main goal is to do everything behind closed doors without people knowing what they're investigating. And I'm sorry, but I've always been quite against that specific practice, because if we're dealing with potentially new science, I think that, yeah, I understand the scientific process is really long. It's tedious sometimes, even because it's like you make mistakes after mistake after mistake, and then you get to what the real uh, answer is. But the fact that you're doing it behind closed doors, I think alienates people who are not scientists, but also want to know about this. And yes, I think the new media has a huge responsibility with this. But what do you think about this concept of the invisible college? Because I know people that Nolan is part of it, Dr. Jacques Valleé is part of it. What do you think about what they do? And do you think they maybe could be more modern with times?
Look, I'm a newcomer, so I'm the last one to judge about what they have done, because I think they're great and their contributions are enormous. I was rereading The Invisible College, whose 50th anniversary, half a century, is next year, right? And in that situation, in that context, I think it made sense that it was invisible. And now it's become more translucent and lately very visible. I've also spoken with different scientists, and maybe not in the topic of UAPs, but when it comes to psychical phenomena and so on, even scientists who are respected and respectable in main universities, and you would not know that they're not only interested, but in a way working on those themes. And they've expressed their own strategy, and I respect it. Meaning, I'm more vocal, but this is personal too. You know, I had this near-death experience 3 years ago. I felt I was given 40 more years or so of life. I had got tenure, and I felt like, all right, I'm going to come out of the closet. Fuck it, whatever. I'm ready, or maybe I'm not, but I'll do it. But I'm not knocking on everyone's closet saying you must get out. And actually, people do it in different strategic ways. So I'm not opposed to the idea of doing things with different strategies, not being so open about it, being more elliptic. I think that's great, because we need all of these strategies. Now, if it's secret, as you're saying, if it's dishonest, that of course is not a good thing. Another thing to say about colleges, visible, invisible, and so on, is that, to play with words, and you'll see what I mean, sometimes these colleges are impossible colleges, because the moment you try to form a group and you make it public, there are all these tensions from without, and you may speculate more than I about, you know, the destruction of these initiatives from the outside so that they don't work, or from within because of our petty little egos. So the very idea of working in groups on these very topics is challenged to the square power, if you see what I mean. It's difficult because of the topic, and there's something about it, and I'm rambling, but let me say one more thing. You know, there's this theory about the anti-structural nature of this phenomena, the trickster phenomena in psychical research, in UAP. I mean, and the idea is that it's really hard to even study those phenomena, because when you form structures to study them, they in a way subvert them. Right. We don't need to go that far. We can just say it's human nature. So this is a long way of saying I think all options are welcome, as long as we have more and more visibility, less and less stigma, and more awe in front of the enigma we're studying.
Yeah, I think that people like you, for example, you've worked with Rupert Sheldrake. He's one of those people who dare speak their minds on what they're studying in public, and I respect him tremendously for that, and you too. I wanted to ask you more about this published science publishing process, because I know that you haven't paid much attention to the Nazca mummy case, because of some people that are maybe involved in it. But I think I've been doing a little bit more investigation into it, and I am trying to get someone to publish a paper. So, what would that process be like for someone who's trying to publish something so controversial and so frowned upon? Because the man that I'm speaking about is Dr. Celestino Piotti. He founded the specialty of medical physical anthropology in Argentina. He is well credentialed to talk about these topics, and he still gets a lot of criticism. And I know that when he tries, if he does, to publish a peer-reviewed scientific paper about his findings, I know he's going to go through some issues. So what would you recommend him do in this climate right now?
Yeah, these are all complex issues because there's always kind of the vanilla answer, the official answer, and the bonus track answer. Also here with respect to publishing. Let's put it this way. Those who have never published and they don't know, I mean, I can explain what it is like to publish, and I can explain you in a moment, like the process, like the official process and actually how it works. Those who have never published may think that once a paper is published, it's a quasi-truth of science. It's like it gets this stamp, which it does, right? Because it's peer-reviewed, and so it's a procedure by which you kind of authenticate the study. But that's far from the end, because even once you've published something, some people should try to replicate it, and sometimes they cannot replicate it, and that's also fine. And you need many years, and then that those sets of truth may be overruled by a new paradigm. Sorry, so it's not that you publish and that's it. Sometimes people say, oh, it's published research. Well, sure, but you can have published research that says the opposite, right? Even without being fraud involved or anything like that, because science in theory is this self-correcting mechanism, and self-correction also happens when you publish. So that would be what some people, but then some people may say exactly that. So if you publish it, you got it. So I would ask this man or whomever wants to publish why they want to publish, right? And I suppose the answer is credibility, because if you publish, they believe you better. A footnote here, peer-reviewed publishing, it's relatively recent. I mean, I haven't studied in detail the history of it, but it's worth mentioning. I think Eric Weinstein has also expressed it in another podcast, that some of the great scientists ever, the Einsteins of the world, the Max Plancks of the world, and so on, they didn't need to publish. I mean, publish as we do it today was something that didn't exist, or that was optional, or it was a formality where you would not have to go through what we're going today. That's not to say we don't need it now, but let's not equate published with science, right? Now, let me describe a little bit how it works, and then give you the advanced critique of publishing, because in that piece also, I argue that peer-reviewed papers are often not done by our peers, and that the review is not an unbiased assessment. Again, because we're human beings, and if you write about something that really challenges the established view, the system will resist it. And look, before, Pavel, I used to be more adamant about it, even more fierce, even a bit angry. Now I just get it. Any organization, any structure, including science, has to be conservative. It has a kind of homeostasis. It's trying to keep the internal variables constant, that we call status quo. But it also needs to be able to welcome novelty and change, right? So that's the whole tension. If you submit science as usual to a journal, you'll have no more problems than the obvious ones, which is your paper well written? Is the data properly collected? Are the statistics well done? Are you citing the proper sources, and are you scholar in your approach? Are your conclusions, do the conclusions match, or are they supported by the data? And this is hard enough. This is what you learn when you practice science. So all of that needs to be there. But of course, if you're writing about something like this case, then you start hearing the phrases extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, or that's impossible, or that's pseudoscience. And then what will happen, most likely, I can predict, is that if you submit that work to a journal and it has all the check boxes correct, statistics, what I was just mentioning, right? If everything is correct, it's quite likely, or let's put it in another way, it's not unlikely that it doesn't pass the editor at the at the entrance of the bar. You see, you won't even get it. You won't even get it to reviews, and if you do get it to reviews, you'll probably get some. You'll get it reviewed by the guys who supposedly represent the status quo because they are the experts, and it's quite likely that they'll be fiercely critical about it, because I understand they don't want to have false positives. This is another way of expressing it, right? False positives, false negatives. So that's how I see what will happen. Now, another aspect here is, where are you going to publish it, right? Because there are many journals. Now, there's so many journals. Some of them are literally scam businesses, and you can tell by the way they write the emails, right? We sometimes make fun of it. For instance, they would say, "Dear Dr. Marin, you know, maybe their chatbot, their chatbot didn't get it." And then there are other journals that I won't name that are at the edge, because they're just want to make money. And this is the other thing. People don't know that we do science with, usually, well, in the United States and in other places, sometimes you get funding from private foundations and so on, but mostly we do it from taxpayers' money. So taxpayers' money, this comes to us through the government. It pays our salaries, it pays our lab equipment, it pays all the effort, we do the research, and then when we submit it to a journal, we have our peers review it. So in a way, they're spending their time taking care of our paper and giving us feedback, which can be good. And then once we've done all of that, we pay to the journal. And it's not that we pay to the journal a fee that would amount to the hours of organization. No, it's like some of these journals, like top journals, glam journals, can charge you $10,000 for a
Holy
paper.
crap.
So at the end of the process, you still need to have $10,000 more from taxpayers to basically pay your work that you've already done. And at the same time, you've worked for free for that journal to review somebody else's paper, right? So some journals are really into this, and this is fact. I don't know the figures now, but Elsevier and others make billions. It's like the pharmaceutical industry in a way. They make billions out of science.
Whoa.
And then if you want to publish it in a really top journal, well, that's why they're called top journals. It's going to be really hard. There's some exceptions. For instance, this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary as well of this paper about remote viewing published in Nature by Tarek and Pudov, right? That was an anomaly that this got in. So, sorry, Pavel, I'm always very long in answering. Now I'll give the short answer.
Oh, that's perfect, man.
They should try to publish it. It's a good thing. I don't have a lot of hope that it will make it into a big journal, and maybe it makes it into an average journal, perhaps because of finding a charitable editor that's really open-minded and wants to see the problem based on what's presented and not based on their a priorities of what is possible or not possible. And at the end of the day, one must ask, would it make a difference? Because that's another thing. You publish it, and then people move on, and they will say, well, they publish it, but in what journal? Who cares about that? So you see, again, the sociology of science is very important.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult, but I think that he has to try it because he has a very interesting theory about all of this. He's the only one who has hands-on experience on investigating these corpses. And I do think that a peer-reviewed paper of that theory would be a major contribution to the field. So thank you for your advice. I'm going to show this to him so he can proceed carefully and with more a clear picture of what he can do and he can't do.
Let me add two things. One is because the topic has high stakes, right? The study needs to be impeccable.
Yeah.
You know, that would be kind of putting our super rigorous hat, right? Because it's going to be scrutinized a lot, right? So it needs to be done very well. That's one thing. The other thing I would advise, if I may, is you need to do some networking. People go to conferences, not so much to learn about the new research, but to have dinner or drinks with the editor of the journal, or to make new colleagues by just talking about with a beer, right? So you also need to know your editors, and you need to explain them, look, trust me, I have something that's important, and if published, this is going to be a paper that's going to be celebrated in times to come. So there's a little bit of politics involved as well in doing that.
And there are
Because
many
otherwise
scientists.
one is, yeah, and I'm just saying, because I used to be that naive as everyone, because when you're brought up in the system, you learn the rules, A, B, C, D, like in football, you're wearing the Football Club Barcelona. Let me get into another mess here. And I don't follow football that much, or soccer, as people say at the other side of the Atlantic. But sure, you need to follow the rules of the game. But then, there are things going on with referees, and there are contextual factors that also determine who's going to win the cup.
And also there are many scientists who they're very used to being in the lab or in front of their computer, and they don't really like socializing that much. So that becomes a challenge for many of them. And I totally understand when they go like, more people? I don't want to be around more people. Why do I have to pander to someone that I don't know? But yeah, it is very necessary, as you well put it. So I want to move on a little bit, because there's something you also did recently with a famous podcaster, Mr. Curt Jaimungal. You guys did a UAP compendium, and there have been a few before, but I think this is one of the most complete that I've seen so far. I want to ask you, how was it that you connected with Curt, and how was that experience like? So people can know, because that was really cool what you did.
All right. Well, first thing to say is this is really work in progress. We're working on it at our paces, because we are all very busy with many other things. But Pavel, in a way, I was reflecting, you opened the door wider for me to become more than curious in this topic. So thank you for that. When we had that conversation a few months ago, and I was smiling as I was driving here today, because who's to blame here? It's again Dr. Grinberg, you see, because Dr. Grinberg, when I was studying his work, and that led me into ESP and other ways to entertain what's the brain. So already Grinberg opened the door for me, and you contacted me because of his work. So here again, another weird door has opened to when it comes to UAPs. Now, I've recently realized that, let me say one more thing. I haven't seen any, I haven't had experiences. I never followed really the newspapers or the magazines about the UFO phenomenon. I wasn't dismissive about it, but I never really cared. It's only very recently, because I've realized, and maybe we talk about this more today, those anomalies in capital A, I believe, and not just believe, I think, and I sense, they have a lot to do with the other phenomena, the other edges of consciousness I'm studying, like near-death experiences and ESP and so on. So it's like, wow, this is another big island in this archipelago, right? Okay, so as I started reading about it, I wanted to have a bird's eye view. And probably I was influenced by helping Robert Lawrence Kuhn, this public intellectual, to make, I only helped him in making a figure of an incredible paper he's published a few months ago that's called A Landscape of Theories of Consciousness. So in this paper, he writes about at least 225 different theories of consciousness, covering all the isms, right? Physicalism, illusionism, dualism, panexperience. All right, this is consciousness studies. It's related. So I helped him make a figure where we could see all the options, like seeing the forest and the trees. Now, as I was reading all of these books, catching up with the literature on UAPs, maybe it's because I'm a physicist. It's like I needed to have kind of a sense of all possible options, right? So I started compiling them, and then I don't recall exactly. Perhaps we had exchanged a few private messages with Curt, and I saw he'd done some podcasts on that, so he was clearly interested. So I proposed to him to work together on, doing a taxonomy like the landscape of consciousness of UAPs. And of course, there are other people who've done them, and we looked at those as well. So some people, we made that figure and we posted it. And of course, you get some people saying, "Oh, you're grifters, you're not." Of course, we know some people have done some categories. Our goal is precisely to put them all together, see if there's something missing, put more, grow, and then prune, right? So we did that, and right now we're working on writing with a set of subsections a description of each of them. And it's really, at least my way, I don't know about Curt exactly why he wants to do it, but I suppose it's a way to really get deep into the topic and contemplate, entertain. I really love this word, not endorse, but entertain all possibilities, including the possibility that we will never understand them. That's pretty fascinating too. So that's where we are in this project, and I thought it was going to take us a short time, but no, I think it's going to take us longer, because this is a beautiful black hole, and you're pulled towards it. So there's a lot to consider.
And I think you are an experiencer, Àlex, because you had a near-death experience, and that is part of the phenomenon, because many experiencers who after have a near-death experience, they also have other experiences attached to that afterwards. And I wanted to ask you about this specifically because when someone has a near-death experience, something changes within their physiology, not just their mind. And they start like having a different outlook on what they are experiencing, like the experience of reality. I wanted to ask you, how do you think these changes have affected you after your near-death experience? Do you think it's related to your newly found interest in UAP? What do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know about my physiological changes. I haven't measured them, but certainly psychological and here, or spiritual even, and scientific. So here we'll be talking about this duality of the psychophysical, right? Which is, has a lot to do, by the way, with how are we going to solve or address this mystery, if we can at all. So personally, it took me a few months to recover, and so I was busy with the practicalities of life, right? So it's not that, at least in my case, you come out of a near-death experience and you're some sort of elevated being, right? I was the same person, same vices, same virtues, more or less. But there's something personal that changes, I would say, because you have a sense you've been at the threshold, maybe at the other side, maybe at the threshold, maybe let's just say somewhere very special. And then sometimes during the day, when you do things, if you remember that moment, at least in my case, you have a kind of a smile of saying, well, look, this is much bigger than we imagine, right? So that's at the personal level. At the professional level, which go together, in my case, because I don't separate them too much. That's why I came out of the closet, as I was telling you a few minutes ago. I decided that this had happened to me as an experience, and this is very related to UAPs again. He's the experiencer. Okay, I was the experiencer of that, and whatever that means, whatever interpretation we give, whatever theory. But now it turns out I'm a physicist and a neuroscientist. So what does the expert say about the experiencer? And in this case, both were within me, right? So what do these two experts, so-called experts, what are they going to tell the experiencer about the experience, right? And so that has led me, actually, Pavel, into two different paths that go together. One is where I was already going, asking what's really a brain. Is a brain a productive organ of thoughts, of perceptions, of memory, or a permissive organ, right? The filter theory of brains. But also has made me realize that I need to go back and renew my physics license and ask, given all these impossible phenomena, to call them somehow, right? What room is there in what I've learned about physics? What I've learned, what I remember, my PhD was in thermodynamics, but anyways, I can go back and try to, remove some dust from quantum electrodynamics and general relativity and say, well, what interstices do we have there to try to make sense of these experiences? So you see, it goes hand in hand. And let me add one more thing. When I speak about these things in public, especially in conferences where there's people, not in Zooms, at the end, something beautiful happened. People come to me and they say, hey, Mr. Gomez, or Dr. Àlex, or however they call me, they say, 23 years ago, I had a near-death experience. I almost drowned and I saw myself from above, and I haven't told this to anyone. But now, because I've heard you, and look, I'm not saying this because now, thanks to me, it's like now because you've said so, I feel I can share with you. I never shared it with anyone in 23 years. So why is it important to at least speak about these things, even if we don't know really what they are or where they come from? Because they happen to a lot of people. So rather than ridicule them, tell them they're stupid or they're crazy, we should say, please talk about them. And sorry, I digress a lot, but let me say another thing, Pavel. and I have as much time as you need, if we need to go longer. I was making a parallel between the history of NDEs and of UAPs. And I know very little about UAPs because I'm learning. Also, I must say a lot from you when I text you messages and you help me find people, books, and so on. So you're kind of my advisor there. But when it comes to NDEs, and next year is the 50th, it seems like I like birthdays. Next year is the 50th anniversary of Raymond Moody's book. And he was at Virginia, and he was the one who coined the term near-death experience. And it's like there are other major books. I don't want to do a disservice to the literature, but it's kind of the kickoff. Why? Two things. One, the technology allowed to reanimate and resuscitate people. Technology allows for something we couldn't do before, so people can come back. Second, it's not technical. The second is phenomenological. Doctors start to listen to what patients have to say without judging them. So doctors shut up, patients dare to speak, and because they were brought back, they start wondering, wow, these guys are telling the same story over and over, and it seems impossible because their brain was pretty flat. So you see what's going on with UAPs now. We have new technologies that allow to measure things in a new way. And if we let people express what they've experienced, again, not banging on their closets if they want to voluntarily come out, if they're comfortable enough telling us what happened, then we can do something like what we started doing. And when I say we, I mean the greats 50 years ago. And when it comes to NDEs, let people talk about them and use that as raw material to build a science around it.
Yeah, and without stigma, and allowing for all the data to be put on the table and not just dismiss it because it's just raw data. That is something that happens a lot with these science celebrities and that you were speaking of at the beginning. I wanted to ask you about non-locality in consciousness, because the first conversation we had, I was really green when it came to a lot of this, and I've read a lot of books since. I've informed myself a little bit more, and I wanted to ask you again, what do you think about Dr. Grinberg's experiment of transferred potential? Do you think there was really something there? Do you really think consciousness is non-local? And do you think that experiment really had something in it worth telling?
Okay, many things here. And I'll say, I really say what I think, because sometimes we're trying to be too polite, but I love Dr. Grinberg. I love Jacobo's work in all respects, like his imagination, his courage, his theory, his boldness in the lab. Now, those experiments carried out, is it now 30 years ago? Because the 1994 paper, right, with Manuel de la Flor, Amit Goswami, and another author whom I don't recall if there's a fourth one, apologies. Lea.
Yeah, Lea.
Lea, perdona, Lea, I know Lea as well. You're right, okay. That's a great paper. Let me say three things about the paper. It's a great paper, but today probably wouldn't go through peer review. You can say it's because of the technology, because of some controls that maybe would have need to be stronger. But it's a valid piece of research. Now, I don't think Jacobo and his team knew about previous works that had been done along those lines. So there's a 1965 science paper whose authors I don't recall. It's a strange paper. It's just one page. It's about two twins and a few more where they were measuring whether they had also correlations between their brains when they were separated, therefore non-local, right? And this paper has another story. It could be a rabbit hole because, and I learned this from Dean Radin, who looked into it. When you go and see the reference number to the agency that funded it, it doesn't exist. So then you realize it was perhaps part of a program that didn't want to be known. And anyways, and then they published a second paper that's now unclassified when they did more. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that the so-called transfer potential, and maybe I should briefly explain what that is, but the idea is that usually in brains, we can evoke potentials, we can evoke activity in many ways all the time. And in very simple experiments, you have an animal or a human, we are also animals, by the way, but you have rats or humans, and then you can flash a light, and then you can see somewhere in the brain, of course, there should be a response, right? That's an evoked potential. Grinberg coined this term transferred potential. And the idea was, for instance, if you and I, Pavel, are very close by and we spend time together, we're bonded, whatever that means, and then we're separated and we put in Faraday cages where we know for sure that we won't be picking up each other's electromagnetic signals because they're blocked. Now, if they evoke a potential in you by flashing a light or a specific protocol, would we see that in the similar region of my brain, a similar potential is evoked, and therefore it would be transferred from your brain to mine? So they were really inspired by the experiments of Aspect and others that then became a Nobel Prize 3 years ago, I recall.
Yeah.
So they were saying, look, if you can do this with particles, right? Why can't we do it with brains? Let's do it, right? So again, long story short, summary is it's a great study. I don't think they were aware of previous research because they don't cite it, but there's previous research, and researchers have replicated that a number of times afterwards. And also, to be fair, some replications haven't worked. Look, what we were saying about papers. You publish a paper, some people try to do it again, and they don't find those correlations. Another people does it again, other group, and they do find them, right? I would say now, considering all there is, and there are not so many papers, but maybe 12, let's say a dozen, of the order of a dozen, you could say that this phenomenon, look, if that wasn't a controversial topic, we would have no problem saying it's been scientifically validated, right? So I think there's empirical evidence that something like that is possible. Now, we have no idea how it's possible, and that makes it difficult in all these themes, because if you know a what, but you don't know a how, you have a hard trouble, because you're saying this happens, but it's not just that you don't even know how it could be possible. Therefore, we invoke non-locality, which is this fantastic idea from quantum physics, which means, and my way of explaining it, let me do it. I do my little trick with the pens. We have these two pens, right? They work together. We separate them. We do something on one, and then we can measure that when we did something on these, we know, like, if one had to be up and the other had to be down, and we don't know. When we measure this is up, then we immediately know that this is down. But how could this know if there was no time to send a message across space-time, right? So a way of expressing non-locality, which is a very difficult idea, is that even if we did that and we think that this is one system and this is another system, the whole thing was one system. So we cannot speak of parts as if they were new wholes. These two continue to be a whole. Now, mathematically, you can do experiments when it comes to quantum mechanics, but again, I'm not sure how one would say that that's going on in brains. Now, let me add one more thing, the bonus track here, because I told you I've been going back to what do I know about physics. Some people, and I've done it, and I still do it, say, well, a way to think about it is non-locality. But if you use this as an analogy, that's great. But if you want to make the analogy concrete, well, then in physics, in quantum physics, there are theorems that don't allow you to signal, for instance, messages from the red pen to the blue pen and vice versa. So if we want to go all literal about entanglement and non-locality, quantum physics doesn't let us do it. So still question mark, big question mark. If that's possible, and many people say it's rubbish, but I don't think so. We have no clue how it is possible.
Do you think that Nobel Prize, based on that experiment, could have included some of the people in that paper, or do you think they didn't reach the level of being worthy of
I
a
don't
Nobel
think so,
Prize?
because the
You
Nobel
don't?
Prize we're talking about is in physics, and it's after many experiments covering what's called the loopholes, all the possible interpretations as to where's the signal going through and so on. And these experiments were already happening in the 80s, right? And in the 90s, when Jacobo cites them actually in his paper. So he was aware of that cutting edge research in physics. But no, I don't think that when they granted a few years ago this Nobel Prize in physics, they would have included Jacobo and his team. Another matter is what Jacobo would have done if he had been around with us 30 more years, right? Remember, look, this is another thing to mention. He was doing not only consciousness studies, but really cutting edge consciousness studies with shamans, trying to see the electrophysiological basis of telepathy. Jacobo never said that that's telepathy, because for it to be telepathy, you need to be aware of the information, and right. So he was looking at this physiological basis of telepathy, inter-hemispheric coherence in shamans in the 80s. And the as I sometimes explain, the sanctioning by Crick, the Nobel laureate, of consciousness studies as an orthodox field happened in the 90s. So 10 years before it started to be possible to study consciousness in orthodox labs, Jacobo was already miles away. So 30 years later, who knows what he would be doing or had discovered by now.
Yeah, I think it was him and Itzhak Bentov who were like on the cutting edge at that time. And that what you talked about just now, the interhemispherical coherence, that is another experiment that he performed very well. And that was also already being done before he was doing it, correct? Is that correct?
I'm not so versed in that. I would not be able to tell you, Pavel.
Okay.
Maybe it wasn't done in the way he was doing it, because he had this idea from his own experiences. And that's another thing for those of us who've had the pleasure to read his biography, his autobiography, right? Where he explains his adventures. He would go to these places, what is it, Morelos, or this hut he had somewhere, and spend their weeks and meditate and meet weird people. So he took all those ideas and brought them back to the lab. So I think he can be called a pioneer in studying that in the context of, or with the hypothesis of, which is based on his synergistic theory, because that's what guided everything he did, that that these should be consistent with his own idea about the relationship between brains and space and consciousness, that these shamans who did miracles in a way would have particular processes and properties in their neural activity, and that's why he was going after that. So probably studies of brain coherence had been done before, but I don't think with the idea of saying, all right, this is a signature of higher states of consciousness and so on.
This is where I think UAP connects with what Jacobo was doing, because as you are aware by now, Dr. Gary Nolan has been studying a specific part of the brain, the caudate putamen. And he found that out of 100 patients that were subjected to studies, when a certain agency approached him, he managed to cross out 85 of them because that was different. But 15 of them did have some kind of experience with UAP. And that made that specific part of the brain have a little more tissue that was living tissue. And he claims that there is literature that says that this part of the brain has to do with human intuition. We know that Jacobo, in his books about shamans, he mentions the caudate nucleus, which is a slightly different part of the brain that is close to the putamen, and that he found in Don Panchito specifically, uh, unusual and more activity in that part of the brain when these shamans were performing their what do you call them? Magic surgeries? What do you call them? Do you think there's a correlation there between people who experience UAP and these shamans who apparently have these abilities?
The answer is I don't know, but I understand perfectly as a neuroscientist that looking for footprints in the brain is a holy grail, because we emphasize these things go beyond the brain. I think I've already mentioned now today that I think the brain is more of a filter, a permissive organ than a productive. That's all very nice. But at the same time, things have to go back to the brain. Like when you work with talented people in the lab, you can do this in psychical research or in normal psychological or cognitive studies, right? You ask them things that may be mental, whatever you think mental is, but at the end of the day, they reply, they respond, so they have to move their tongue or they have to move their finger and write down, right? So that's just to say, yes, beyond the brain, but back to it. And so, yeah, that's kind of looking, what's the saying in English? A needle in a haystack. So there are all these haystacks, and we want to discard most of them and then have smaller subset that become more and more interesting. This is, again, it's like correlating an anomaly with another anomaly. You have a psychical anomaly here or psychological, and you're looking for the neurophysiological substrate that's also an anomaly that could correlate with them. And that's how science is doing. This is science 101. You look for something solid on one hand, and you try to correlate it with the other thing. After correlation, you need theories. That's why I insist, maybe it's because I'm a theoretical physicist, I'm biased. You can have lots of correlations, and maybe this becomes a bit boring now when I explain it, but the whole business of neuroscience, orthodox normal neuroscience, as it is of genetics, is to find correlations between phenotype and genotype, right? And maybe to upgrade those correlations to causation, to say, if I mess with this gene or if I mess with this neural circuit, I mess with this function. And if I restore the function of the gene or the circuit, I restore the function. In that case, it could be a mental function, right? So this is the next step in the game. But you can do this all day long and discover fascinating things. And the brain is so complex. And basically, you'll be poking in different places and many things will be happening. Actually, I often joke, because a great deal of the titles of the PhDs that are defended in biology labs are the role of ... in ... and there you can inject your favorite circuit, right? So that's not to dismiss that work. I'm just saying we need to find correlations because these are anchors, and then we need to have a theory that can upgrade those even causal links to a proper understanding of what's going on. So back to Jacobo, he had that theory. Another matter is to what extent it has been tested, to what extent it's correct. But yeah, all the power to Nolan and everyone else who's trying to fish for those anchors in the brain that reflect. But you see, Pavel, the Egyptians knew that already, in the sense that the first paper, you could say, of someone who realized that there was this guy there was a bar who I think went through his skull, and then the Egyptians wrote, and he has problems walking. So it's the art of correlations and causation. We need more than that. But in certain topics like UAP, we need to start from the beginning. So it's really a good starting point to see what's different and what's the same upon these cases. And I recall, and I watched, I think I watched the clip you posted yesterday, I think, where there's this segment of the documentary, right? This recently premiered documentary.
Yeah.
And they're intriguing things, right? Because these neural structures, you may think they have to do with malfunction or disease, right? So you see it's fuzzy because you have things that have to do with intuition, but at the same time, they also have to do with mental disease, perhaps. And so we are at the edges. That's a sign that we are at the edges. It's not as clear as when you know what's going on.
It's kind of a shame that there aren't many shamans left in the world. specifically here in Mexico. There are some, but very few have like the old practices from centuries ago. And I wonder if we could maybe try and find a correlation if we studied their brains right now of the ones that are left and compare it to people who have experienced UAP phenomena. Because I do find, for example, the case of Chris Bledsoe, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
I do find it very interesting that right after he had his experience, he started having multiple different experiences, according to him. And other people in NASA and in the CIA do confirm that the experiences he's had are real. I know that people go to him to try and see if they can see orbs, and some of them do. I wonder if having an experience with a UAP does awaken a certain part of the brain that can make you more susceptible to stuff that is already may already be out there and we just can't see or experience. Because this is a nice segue to talk about two books that I know you're very familiar and fond of: The Daimonic Reality from Patrick Harpur and Passport to Magonia from Jacques Valleé, who have very a lot of similarities within them. And they do talk about this, that there is like some sort of uh, different reality that we live amongst and we can't see really because we're not equipped to. What do you think about that? And
Yeah,
what's your take on
yeah.
those books?
I adore Patrick Harpur. He's an amazing man. I've had the chance to talk to him publicly and privately a few times. I asked him for advice. He's also very funny, and he knows a lot. Recently, I asked him, "What do you think of Passport to Magonia?" And he said, "Well, I think I can share this because it's not confidential. It was an email exchange." But he said, "Well, you first, Àlex. What do you think?" And so I said what I thought. But then I asked him, "What about you?" And then he said, "Look, I very deliberately wrote Daimonic Reality without reading Passport to Magonia because I didn't want to be influenced. But at the end of the day, they're both saying something very similar. Maybe Harpur says it in a more emphatic way, and maybe Valleé has changed a little bit the interpretation. But what I found fascinating about both books, and maybe I speak more about Patrick Harpur's because I've read that book very carefully. Also, because it's very surprising. I encourage everyone to read it, even the more the more Puritan minds that will probably are not listening, but not here, because they don't want to get contaminated by pseudo thoughts. But I was so surprised because every chapter of Daimonic Reality is some crazy shit I would have never spent the time reading about.
Yeah.
But he's a good writer, a good storyteller, plus the meat that I'll in a moment I'll unfold, that I explicate, I think, what he's trying to say. So here you go and you're reading about fairies, and the next one is about little man, and the next one is about crop circles, and I'm like in a roller coaster, like, what am I reading? But then he puts basically all on the table. And my way of summarizing what I understand his thesis to be is, we often speak about the realm of fact, and then the other alternative is fiction. And you can see this, by the way, it's another segue, but I hope you enjoy it. In a recent discussion that Richard Dawkins had with Jordan Peterson, and you may
Oh
think whatever you
yeah.
want about
I
both
saw
of
I
them.
saw clips of them. Yeah.
Well, but you see, there is Dawkins and Alex O'Connor, a very intelligent man who's mediating the conversation, and seems like they're both on top of Peterson. It looks like a UFC fight.
Yeah, and
Peterson is
Peterson
trying to,
asked about dragons, right? That part.
but they're all on top of him. So tell me, but it was the resurrection? Did it happen or not? If we put a camera there, we would see it or we wouldn't. It's like basically what they're trying. That's my interpretation again. What they're trying to do with Peterson is collapse his wave function, if I can use an analogy, into either fact or fiction. Right? They're pressing, and Peterson is doing a really good job, because it's very difficult to just stay coherent and uncollapsed and say, no, I'm talking about myth, but I'm talking about myth not as if it was just fiction, because fiction usually means made up whatever, and fact means the ground truth, what we should care about. So why am I saying this? Because when I read Patrick Harpur's Daimonic Reality, he's here, and he has other beautiful books, actually I have them here, on alchemy and on the soul and so on. It felt like a lot of the science I do, which sometimes is not only science, it's also philosophy and maybe a kind of mysticism, I feel like I'm crossing levels in a video game. You see, I'm like, okay, materialism, I think I get what's going on with these, and maybe we can go beyond. Okay, I passed this level, ¿no? Esta pantalla que decimos en español, no sé cómo decís ahí en México, this level. And then recently I discovered secularism, what secularism does to these themes, right? And it's very important, especially in UAPs, if you think of it from a secular point of view, from a religious or from a pseudo-religious. But with Harpur, I discovered another ism, which is literalism. This is the key thing about daimonic reality. And he warns us with all those examples that if we try to explain each of those cases as a dichotomy between is it fact or is it fiction, we will always fail. So when I got this after 23 crazy examples, it's like, wow. So what he's saying, and these are my words, is that between fact and fiction, there's a synapse, like in neurons, there's a space which is imagination. And he's saying the realm of imagination is very real, super real, and very serious. And from it, we get things that happen in the world that become facts, and we can measure them. But facts is not all there is, and the rest isn't made up fiction. And by the way, if I can do this, let me see if I have it here. Yeah. In this wonderful book, right, Abduction, at the introduction,
a classic.
You know, I'm trying to back it up, man. A classic. Well, I won't do the pedantic thing of just quoting something, but it's so remarkable. Well, it's here. It's page 20, and here, Mac explains that he was a friend with Thomas Kuhn, the famous Thomas Kuhn, right? Philosopher of science. And can I read this, Pavel?
Yeah, go ahead, man.
This is what Patrick Harpur is saying. He said, I knew Thomas Kuhn since childhood, for his parents and mine were friends in New York, blah, blah, blah. So they knew very well. What I found most helpful was Kuhn's observation that the Western scientific paradigm had come to assume the rigidity of a theology, and that this belief system was held in place by the structures, categories, and polarities of language, such as real and real, exists, does not exist, objective, subjective, intra-psychic, external world, happened, did not happen. And then this is fantastic, he says. He suggested that in pursuing my investigations, I suspend, to the degree that I was able, all of these language forms and simply collect raw information. So Thomas Kuhn, the great Thomas Kuhn, is saying this other genius, this dichotomy between happened, didn't happen, like there's a sighting, did it happen or not? If we put a camera, would we see it? We need to suspend that, and this is really hard because as it said here, it's in the Western mind, right? So it's not a habit that you whiff off easily. So long way to say, and I think that's what Jacques Valleé is also saying there, saying let's pay attention to myth and folklore, not psychology. That's fantastic. It's not that we need to psychologize this, which we also have to take into consideration the psychology of the experiences. We need to go into myth and folklore because that's the proper home of imagination. And that's why the humanities, and we could tie this to Jeff Kripal, right? That's why the humanities are the super humanities. And without them, even if we've had the greatest gadgets and all the projects to measure things, I don't think we will make sense of the phenomenon or the phenomena.
Yeah.
I look like a priest. I look like a priest preaching.
No.
This turns me on.
And if you don't like talking about this sounding like a priest, you're not going to like my next segue, though. Because you spoke to someone that I want to speak to. I hope I get to, Mauro Biglino. And I want to ask you about that experience, because what he did with those translations at the Vatican are deemed controversial. He was excommunicated from the church for the translations he did. And I want to ask you what that experience was like. What do you think about his work? What is what you take the most to heart from his work?
All right. And look, I'm not expert in any of these things. I'm just saying what I think, right?
But you've
It's not
spoken
like,
to the experts too, so it is
yeah,
very
yeah, but
interesting to.
it's not like I'm a Hebrew scholar and no. But look, and we haven't prepared this, it looks like, but I have one of his books here. We haven't, right, Pavel? I mean, you haven't
No,
told
no,
me.
no.
Well, like, okay. So let me tell you the brief anecdote. So I go to a birthday party, I think, with my daughters, and a father from the school, whose daughters go there too, comes to me. We love talking about crazy themes, and he says, "Alex, this is a book for you." All right, thank you. Gods of the Bible. A new interpretation of the Bible reveals the oldest secret in history. Again, I didn't care much about the Bible or an old secret, but I started reading this in the summer, and basically, okay, let me try to summarize what I got from this book. He says, if you go and translate the Old Testament from the sources, and it's very complicated, right? Because what sources and you, again, look, it's related to the keyword we just read from Mac, suspend. If you try to leave behind all the religious interpretation, dogma, consensus that came after, and you only try to see, which is a really hard job for a translator, because translation requires context. But if you don't have the context, you'll bring your own, and then you'll mistranslate. He says, well, if we start doing this, then all these words, Elohim, Ruach, Elijah, Cherubim, and so on, then they don't sound so much as God the Almighty or the Holy Spirit descending, but they sound more like, if I recall correctly, I think Ruach sounds more like a vehicle or something that would, come down. And Elohim maybe doesn't mean Yahweh, the Almighty, only God of monotheism. Maybe it means kind of a ruling superior being, if I recall correctly. No, so he goes and he goes through many topics that are mind-blowing, like kind of the sacrifices that were done, the burning bush. Maybe it wasn't a bush, actually, maybe it was something other that was glowing. So, well, look, I had a great fun reading this. I can only trust his knowledge when it comes to translating. His reputation is that he had been many times asked by the Catholic Church to do this job until he started doing this. And so all of a sudden, it's like it happens as it happened to me when I was listening to Graham Hancock, which, I mean, on all of these names to my colleagues would be like, oh no, the obvious list of suspected pseudo blah blah blah. But all right, maybe there's something about what happened many years ago, and we got the story upside down or really distorted or edulcorated with all these concepts. But maybe these gods of the Bible were other beings that were doing their business here on earth with us. And you see, do I think of it scientifically? Maybe not. Do I think of it as simply fiction? Do you think that Maurer is trying to sell us a novel, pretending it's scholar work? No. Perhaps it's something that's in this superposition state in the realm of imagination. And what if that's true? Now, then you can start to triangulate. You have gods of the Bible, you have abduction, like really different, truly interdisciplinary, right? Like translators, psychiatrists, historians of religion, like Kripal, right? Quantum physicists, why not? People who know about relativity and think about possible ways of having the incredible propulsions we see, on and on and on, and you add them up, and then maybe a picture emerges where these things start to sound a little bit plausible.
Yeah. And also adding all the consciousness studies from Jacobo, and right now from Dr. Donald Hoffman and all of these people who are on the cutting edge of the consciousness part of it. But yeah, it is very, very fun to explore this and keep an open mind about it. I have one last question that I want to ask you, because amongst my investigations into Grinberg's work, I did find some historical data that I wanted to run by you. I'm sure you've already seen it, but I want to ask you, what do you think that was? Grinberg was part of a number of conferences in the 80s. He was in Costa Rica, he was in Brazil, he was in Spain. I've been speaking to Ida Cuellar about this. He's given me a lot of details about this. And I've gotten from the channel people who are in Spain interested in the topic, who've given me some cutouts from newspapers and actual content of the conferences that were given there. One of them was from Jacobo, another one was from John Keel. There was a very interesting one where John Keel talks about that by the end of the century, magic is going to return. And I was very, very curious to hear that from none other than John Keel. What do you think about these conferences that at the time we're already celebrating 100 years of these meetings, because they started in the late 1800s? Why do you think that Jacobo was part of that? And I've been trying to ask questions about it to the people involved that are still alive. I've gotten nothing so far. They've heard the questions. They give me non-answers. Why do you think that's happening? And what was happening back then?
Yeah, I don't know, and I cannot answer as an investigative journalist, but what I can say is that it makes a lot of sense to me, because these guys were pursuing what I call an impossible science. I mean, they knew it was pretty possible. And by the way, we probably know less today than then, in the sense that this seemed to be very normal, maybe through an invisible college. I mean, look, Pavel, I didn't know when I was reading Passport to Magonia and so on, like, oh, Valleé was into parapsychology and psychical research. Like, it wasn't just like maybe he was interested or he had heard talk about it. No, they were pursuing that very actively. So therefore, if Jacobo was trying to understand, how, according to his theory, this interaction between what brains do and space-time can modify what we deem as perception. You see, it's like once you go down that level, everything is connected. And some of the critics would say, oh, these guys, they see patterns everywhere, including in clouds. But no, it makes a lot of sense. I think it's the same reason why I've ended up caring about those things. I had my NDE, and all of a sudden I'm wondering, because you can make logical arguments and say, look, if there's something, for instance, with respect to survival, near-death experiences and the possibility of survival after bodily death. Well, if something survives when we die, it means that when we're living, there's something that's part of us that's somewhere in another realm, right? You can call it immaterial or non-physical or a physics we still don't know. Now, so if that's the case, then you should be interested in ESP, right? And these psychical phenomena. Now, when you read what's going on with these experiencers, or even with the kinds of things that are seen doing weird stuff, well, they sound a lot, and actually people say it. And isn't this what Valleé explains, that the way people, back to the phenomenology, people speak as if they're having conversation telepathically. It's the way we have to express it. Well, when I was in the tunnel in my NDE, it was a well, and I was looking upwards, and there were 3 figures waiting for me. I was communicating with them telepathically, meaning I wasn't having a chat, I wasn't speaking. Maybe I wasn't even thinking. Maybe it was more like feeling or knowing. So again, long way to say, once, I use this metaphor of the islands. I was recently in the Canary Islands. You see the islands, and maybe they're far away, you don't see them in the horizon. You're happy living in your island, but if you would see what's a little bit underneath the water, you see they're all part of the same system, right? And so this is an archipelago of islands, of edges of consciousness. So maybe a few years ago I would have been very surprised, but now it makes a lot of sense that they were they were all there talking about these things. What else could they be? I mean, they're trying to solve, I think, the same mystery expressed in many different ways. So that's what I would say.
And we're trying to solve it as well in this day and age. Let's see if we can get there, because there seems to be a lot of activity recently within the government aspect of it and the politics aspect of it. And yeah, I forgot. I have one last thing I want to talk to you about. You posted a little snippet of a Jacques Valleé book that talks about the division that exists and always comes up in these topics of UAP. And when different groups try to do something together, there's always some kind of disruption that goes on. And I know this from personal experience, because I plunged myself into the Five Eyes English speaking community of ufology, and I can see a lot of division, a lot of misinformation, a lot of people that I consider bad actors that are doing it seemingly on purpose, disrupting and trying to not let the topic move forward. This is happening all over the world. It's not just happening in America. It's happening, as you know, in your country, in Spain. It's happening in Mexico. I've been investigating what's happening in Mexico too. And I wonder, do you think there's some kind of like intention to do that? Or do you think it happens just organically because there are so many difference of opinions and so many different egos? And what do you think, where do you think that comes from?
Okay, I'll end in a mystical spiritual tone. So I would say, well, we're living in an era of misinformation, disinformation, all the prefixes you want to add, including these very same ideas are also misinformation and disinformation themselves. If you see what I mean, like the idea of a conspiracy theory, which was invented so that you can call something. So it's also recursive, and it's everywhere today due to social media mainly. Of course, this was happening before. It was hard to detect, but it was also, I suppose, harder to just spread everywhere. So we're living in this age. Plus, we're human beings and we are egoistic and we have our temperament. And so having a business, having a company, having a lab, having a family, having a partner, it's hard because of petty quarrels. So that's going on in these groups. Then there's another thing that is more surprising to me, apart from these two levels, the sociological and the human-like nature of conflict, which is that I was expecting, when I moved from my more orthodox research, laboratory animals, very interesting, but really nothing at stake when it comes to consciousness and so on. When I moved into these themes that we're discussing, I assumed that because we're dealing at the end of the day with consciousness and with big questions, that the people involved would also be more conscious, you see, and I suspect perhaps it's even the opposite. It's very strange. Like, it's more vicious. And I don't know if maybe we need another kind of analysis here, right? Because there are sociologists of science that study, for instance, themes that are fascinating. And I don't have time to read all these books, like when discovery is premature. That's a fascinating study in the history of sciences. Another one could be what happens with small and big groups. And our groups are typically small, right? Like, it's not like 20,000 people studying this area of the brain in mice, right? So small groups, I think, also lend themselves to these dynamics. And then maybe there's another factor at play, which we discussed at the very beginning of this conversation, which is maybe this trickster element is also present, and this is messing with us as well. And maybe, and that's why I said I would end up in a kind of mystical spiritual tone, maybe you see, we speak about ontological shock and we love these sentences, but at the same time we approach the phenomenon. I mean, I'm not wearing a white coat, but as if we put the white coat, study it, and we would not get wet, right? But I don't think this is going to happen. And no. Well, there's the hitchhiker effect, but there's the experimenter effect in psychical research. What I'm trying to say, and I think I mentioned this to you maybe offline, I have tons of folders here, but these folders are not the kind of folders I used to have in my previous research topics. Like when I would close my Drosophila, my fruit fly olfaction folder, it would stay there. But these things, in Spanish, it works well. We say tocar un tema, to address, to study a topic. And I say, well, el tema te toca a ti. So the topic you're tackling tackles you back. So therefore, maybe all of that, maybe the only way, and by the way, I don't think we will solve the UAP problem. I don't think this is a grand Sudoku to crack. But as we learn more about it, I think we will need to also kind of evolve in our own consciousness. And maybe that's why it's so hard. So far, it's so hard to study this because, I don't want to talk about specific examples, but the moment you start an initiative, and that's why this quote you were alluding to by Valleé, when I read it, it was like, fuck, he nailed it. And it's 55 years ago and he nailed it. He says, we spent virtually all of our time solving the conflicts, the scheduling, the organization, the arguments, the money, and 1% to actually do what that organization was supposed to do, which was to study the phenomenon. So we have big homework. How are we going to work in groups? And let me add one more thing. I consider myself a lonely wolf. I love being locked in my room when I was doing physics with pen and paper, now programming or writing and so on. So how do you do it when you don't want to be a sheep, a flock, a group of sheep, but how do you put many lonely wolves together and so that they can operate like a whole, right?
I think that's part of the test and the challenge and the learning curve, because if we can't agree to socialize and to create stuff together and to solve problems together, I don't think we honestly are worthy of solving the UAP issue in the first place. So if we manage to somehow get past that ego and get through that frowned upon way of looking at things and at people in general that don't agree with us, we're never gonna get to whatever this is, to the bottom of it. And I think that the more people that come into this space, like you, like Ida, like me, like Christian Harloff, like all of these people that are new, that have a different outlook and a fresh perspective, are very important to the movement itself, because they are the ones that are not contaminated by all of this rhetoric that is going around, and competition, because there's a lot of it. And when you see someone who's doing a breakthrough or talking about something that maybe you could have thought about, instead of going like, shit, why didn't I think of that? You can go like, man, that's really interesting. Let's expand on it. That's the way I see it. And I think that it is going to be really difficult, but I think we need to try, because there seems to be some kind of a clock ticking, and we're kind of running against it already. So I want to thank you, Àlex, for your time. Again, I hope we can do this again soon. And maybe after you guys are probably more public with the UAP compendium, that would be really cool if we can talk about it more in detail.
Sure.
I'm going to try and get Curt too, so we can do a three-way conversation. But anything you want to promote, where can people find you if they want to talk to you about all of these things? And thank you again for being a second-time guest on Psicoactivo.
I like you, man. We can do this another time. And how much I enjoy and appreciate the messages we exchange and so on. So we were doing the journey together also privately, which is beautiful. I don't have a book. I don't have a super cool website. Just type my name and see what the algorithm has cooked for you. I think that's it, because I'm doing so many different things, writing, reading, experiments, a lot of podcasting. So let's see what the algorithm has for you. Maybe just add one more thing, and I know you're closing, but we want to know the truth. But the last bit we discussed is about trust And I think very often about truth and trust. And without trust, I don't think we will find any decent truth. So it's good that we have people, in my case, with you, with Ida, with Curt, and a community where we cultivate trust. And if we have that trust, then maybe we will get closer to certain truths. And well, it's a challenge, but it's as important, perhaps. Yeah.
Anything you gotta say to Ida, who I'm gonna see in about 2 days here in Tijuana? Any message you got for him?
Yes, that we need to find time to talk and sit down. We always rushing. Well, and say him thanks, because he was the master, what's the name? Janitor is the name in English, who opened the big door with his documentary that then got me interested in Grinberg, which then got me into ESP, which then got me into meeting you. And he would, in a way, we're talking here because of his documentary. And that's what media can do for humanity, can bring these ideas before we scientists have solved our publication problems and funding problems. The ideas are already there, being, happening in the minds of people. And this is a paradigmatic example of a documentary that opened our minds a few months or years later.
Yeah, and that's a perfect way to close this. Thank you very much, Àlex, and I'll see you around. See you guys around. I hope you enjoyed this. I really, really did. And follow Àlex on his. I'm gonna leave all the links in the description so you guys can follow his X page. He gets into really interesting conversations in there, so make sure you follow him. And I'll see you guys until the next video. Bye bye.
How